Okay, so we're returning. Great question, like about what happens when a browser makes a request to the web server to load an HTML page. And we'll walk through this more again, especially when we talk more about HTTP and Django and stuff. It is really good to know now. And actually, one thought that I had during the break is that I think something that's really good to start thinking about with programming in general is like when you're writing software and you're writing code, that's just one piece of the puzzle. The bigger picture is what environment is this code running in? Is it running on my laptop? Is it running on a server? Is it running in the shell command line world? Is it running in the browser? And then like, what tools do I need to use to work on this code? Like we saw with the prettier formatter. And so web apps get kind of tricky because it's two different worlds that collide, the browser world and the server world. So starting from the top, and I will make an incognito page because that way, like the browser cache is cleared. It's not loading anything from memory. I type in the URL that I want my browser to make an HTTP request to. In this case, I'm using this alias localhost that says, hey, this is a network request that is going to me. I'm mailing a letter to myself. And this is the port that I want it to go to. Like I want to mail a letter to the building that I live in and my own apartment number. I hit enter. The browser makes an HTTP request. We can see information about the request here. Over here, we can see that the request was made, an HTTP GET request. What a web server usually does by default, and what a browser kind of expects by default, is that the web server will send back an HTML page if you're not being specific about anything. And by default, it will send back an HTML page named index.html. And that's kind of what the browser expects. And then it loads that page. And as the browser reads through this page line by line, it reads through all this stuff, it renders it to the screen. Down here, it gets to the script tag, and the browser says, hey, there's a source attribute. There is some JavaScript I have to run, but I don't have it. Here is where it lives. The // is the information the server needs to know about where to go get this. Say, hey, server, this index.js file, it's in the same directory as index.html. So the // is saying, telling the server, look in the same directory as this HTML page that this script tag is coming from, and find a file named index.js. And this is where the server receives that HTTP request to get this file. And it sends the text of that file back over the wire, over the internet. And here in the network tab, we can see. So over here, we see like each HTTP request. And you can see all this interesting information about it. You can see the response to, like, here's what's actually sent. It's a bunch of text. So this was the first one to get index.html. And then this is the second one that sends back the JavaScript. And then when the browser gets that JavaScript, it actually runs it because the browser also has a JavaScript engine, a JavaScript virtual machine. That's a really good question. And does that help kind of like walk through a bit more of the process of exactly what's going on there?
Are those the only two files that can be mounted on, or that the system knows to mount automatically?
That's a great question. No, we can do it for whatever we want. Like I can do foo.js and I can do console.log. This is another JS file. And actually, to just show you something interesting, like we were talking about JavaScript and namespacing and scope, this is where we'll get a conflict because the browser isn't going to know that, hey, there's a variable named X here and here. There's no scoping that we're getting. And if I go to my index.html where I have this script tag, we can load that one as well. And now if we do this, a couple interesting things will happen. So I did Command-Shift-R to do a hard refresh to clear the cache and reload the page. You hold down here, also do empty cache and hard reload. So we see, let's look in the network tab, in fact. Actually, let me clear it. And actually, let me clear that and clear that, and we can get a fresh look. Browser requests the HTML page. Server gets the request for the HTML page, sends the HTML page back. Browser starts rendering the HTML one tag at a time. It's loaded the text into like the DOM, document object model tree, gets here, says, hey, I need the server to give me a file. Server, please give me that file. We see that request here in the response. Here we see the server sending that file. And then it does it again. And we run into a problem because I've got this variable X declared in two places. But from the server perspective, it's all the same scope. So if I change that, it'll solve it. I can also, by the way, let's just do this JS code here. Let's move. I'm being lazy and just using the Explorer bar. But now this foo.js lives in the JS stack code here directory. I get everything still renders, but we get this error, file not found. But if I go ahead in my HTML and I update it so that it can give the server the correct path. JS code here, JS code here. Then, oh, and I use the variable y, which also already exists. So we'll name this one Z. We're good to go. So it's like, it's really a folder structure. And then the server just looks for the file in the desired folder. Does that make sense to folks? Awesome. Great question. Yeah, this is like core stuff, and we'll come back to it again. So don't stress out about it. If you want to, like if some of this is new and unfamiliar. Kenneth, so you actually raised a great point in the chat about const and scope. The issue here, it's actually, it doesn't have anything to do with const or let. It has to do with JavaScript and variables as a whole. Like, oh, because it's redeclaring, because the one is overwriting the other. So I take that back, because I guess what happens, I would have thought we would have got an error here. So I take that back. I'm going to pause. I'm not going to go into that rabbit hole right now. And the good news is it doesn't matter, because with modern technologies, we have JavaScript modules and we get namespacing. So yeah, great questions. I'm going to jump back to our HTML and CSS stuff. And I'm going to talk a bit about CSS. And then we will use some. And actually, before I do that, I should add some meta tags. And I remember, Lewis, you had a good question about hey, like, what are these meta tags and what are we using them for? Meta tags aren't the most critical. they do some very important things, and it highlights that like there's a bigger picture too for our HTML page. For instance, this isn't a meta tag actually, but an attribute. So every element has an attribute, or you can give attributes to elements, and it looks like this. Lang here is short for language. And the way an attribute works is sort of like a variable or a property. The left side of the equal sign is the key. The right side is the value. For the script tag, this is a source attribute. And VS Code, honestly, this is amazing because it's like this pretty nice built-in documentation. So I would definitely leverage hovering over stuff in VS Code. And it's grabbing that information from the MDN docs online, which is amazing. And this is relevant because there are many languages, and it should just be EN, which is short for English. I believe ES is Spanish. Chris, that's a great suggestion about Emmet. That's a great tool to use to write HTML, and I really should learn and use it. And please remind us, and we'll mention that to folks, and please also people, you should start kind of sharing tips like that amongst yourselves. So we have this language attribute, we have this source attribute. You can add whatever kind of attribute you want, by the way. It's just that the browser will ignore it. So this works fine. It doesn't break anything. But it just gets ignored. Sometimes we might write JavaScript to use these special attributes. But most of the time, we're adding attributes to elements that are kind of like defined in the specification for how that HTML element works, which is all from MDN docs, which I won't open right now, but people are familiar with. And this kind of goes back to the meta tag. And Louis, your question. The meta tag, it's for information like metadata. Information about the nature of the document. For example, the character set that we use, like how do we render this text? I'm not super familiar with character sets. I think UTF-8 is really standard. And I could be a little wrong here. And if I am, someone please let me know. But like if we were writing an HTML page and using Arabic or Japanese or Chinese, or any language that doesn't use English, what is it? The Roman, not the Roman alphabet. What's the right word?
Starts with an L.
The Latin alphabet. Yeah, basically the characters A through Z that we're all familiar with the English language. We might need to use a different character set to render the text on that page. And actually here again, MDN is being our friend. And this is an example. The meta tag does not need a closing, or the meta element does not need a closing tag. We can just have the one tag, and then we have this attribute character set. We can also use this for things like I'm not sure what the name attribute does. Let's find out. Not exactly sure. That name kind of gets useful, like if you're on a mobile device, I think. Same with the content tag. Like I'm copying this from our tutorial example, and whenever I have to mess with this stuff, I always have to Google it. And honestly, we don't need to worry about any of it right now. Initial scale. But what all this stuff sort of hints at is that we're giving the browser information about how to render this HTML document on some device, on some screen. Does that help a little bit, Louis? And that's a really good question.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, the meta tag definitely worth Googling. Not at the top of the priority list. The big takeaway is, yeah, basically we usually use it for metadata that's telling the browser about like how to render this HTML, or like sometimes you add other metadata, but anything like stuff that we don't want to render in the browser. So CSS. CSS stands for cascading style sheets. Just in the interest of time, I think I'll do the exercise of like talking about each of these terms myself. So we'll start with style sheet. It's just a fancy term for a file that has information about how text should be formatted. Yeah, formatted and presented. Fonts, bold, italic,
Rotation.
padding, yeah, rotation.
Borders.
And then, yeah, layouts. Borders, layout relative to other elements. Cascading, what this means is that like multiple rules can apply to the same HTML elements. And like one CSS rule can sort of inherit behavior from another. They're meant to cascade, interact. There is a priority or weight so that some CSS rules will override others. That is not the best way to describe it, but gets to the essence of it. Like, and we'll see it once we start writing CSS. And in fact, I think I will, yeah, we'll circle back that in a sec. I think I'm just going to dive into writing a little bit of CSS and talking about it as we go. So there's a couple ways to write CSS. You can do it inline, like here in the head. We could have a style element, style is short for CSS. This is kind of a weird way to do it. You probably wouldn't want to do it this way. This isn't exactly inline. Actually, I take it back. This is like adding a rule. Let's look at this first. So the format here is a little funny. The contents of the rule lives inside the curly brackets. This is the name of the element, the HTML element that the rule is applying to. That might break stuff. And this is what the rule is. We're going to look for every paragraph tag, and the term for this is the selector, to select the elements in the tree that we care about. There is some sort of tree traversal algorithm going through the tree of our HTML document and finding all the paragraph elements. And then it's the level of specificity for like, this is the paragraph selector. And this is when the rules relate. Certain rules like have more specificity than others, and it turns them red. So now something should be red. And we've got some stuff that's red.
Can you describe the specificity a little bit more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best way to do that is, let's make this one blue. Color blue. Yeah, so I have two CSS rules here. Here, I created a style. And by the way, most of the time, we're gonna be writing a CSS file. So don't worry too much about like all these techniques. This is just for sort of example and introduction right now. In a minute, I'm going to write a CSS file and show how to import and use that. And that's what we're gonna be doing 90% of the time. So, but this also just illustrates the different ways that you can do it, just like with the script, with the JavaScript. We can have a script tag or we can import a JavaScript file. Right now, we're writing a style tag where we can add a bunch of rules. Like I could also do P, sorry, not P, let's do H1. Color, green, yellow, goldenrod. It's green, yellow, it's gonna be a little gross. So that's just an example of how you have multiple rules inside this style tag. And I know the format here is a little wild. And again, it's actually a lot easier when you're doing it in a CSS file and the editor will help you. And then Jim, going back to your point about specificity. So right here for, and actually this is why DevTools is the best. There we go. So I've got myself a paragraph tag. Over here, we can see all the CSS rules that apply to this element. And we see that there's two. One is, it's called the inline style right here because we defined it on the same line, so to speak, as where we define the HTML element itself, where we set the color. Then we have a global rule with this selector that finds all the paragraph tags and says, hey, if this is a paragraph element, make it blue. And we kind of use the term tag and element interchangeably. I'll try to be careful about that. And so this is great. Like I can click on any element. I can see all the styles. Again, you should really be living in Chrome DevTools when you're doing anything with HTML and CSS. You can even see the computed values for all sorts of stuff to see what the browser figures out. And then if you click here, it shows you the specific rule that's being applied. Here, there's even a file browser where you can see the HTML and JavaScript, and it's really just incredible. So I think you folks see where this is going, but we have two rules with conflicting information, and the way that the browser and CSS is designed is that the inline rule, because it's more specific, because it's about this one specific paragraph tag, as opposed to all paragraph tags, takes precedence and overrides the other one. And actually, that is something that's great to put in notes. When you have two conflicting CSS rules, the one whose selector, the part that determines which element the rule gets applied to. So that is probably, this is why programmer documentation is terrible, because once you start thinking about this stuff, it like gets very jargony and verbose and precise and not so easy to read. But here, I think the illustration is pretty clear. Like we don't even really have a selector for this one because this is an inline style that only applies to this one paragraph tag. And actually, to flesh this out a little bit, let me let me add a rule. Yeah, let me flesh it out a little bit. And does that help a bit, Jim?
Yes, I think, and eventually, I don't know when we learn this, but I know that that right side console is very important for troubleshooting and widths and colors. And I've had a tough time
Yeah,
organically understanding how it is. I know that it's helpful. I just don't understand how to use it.
that's a really good
capably.
point. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That's a really good point. The console and developer tools are pretty powerful and complex these days. One of our evening TAs, Jorge, actually may give us a talk about that. Also, though, to be honest, probably the best way is like as Zainab and I start teaching HTML stuff, we will be using this all the time, and you'll be able to see it. And maybe like if Jorge doesn't give a talk, maybe we'll do like a breakout session, or maybe we'll do a breakout session as well. But I think the starting point is just having it open all the time, and through review sessions and demo sessions and lessons, kind of like seeing how we use it. And you raise an excellent point, which is that here you can also change values to test stuff out, but none of this gets saved. So if I refresh the page, it reloads the data. But when I'm experimenting, like that's when this is really useful, like font size 100 px, that's too big, 20 px, 40. There we go. So you can do all sorts of fun stuff. You can turn it on and off. And then when you refresh the page, it goes back to whatever you have in the code. Speaking of selectors, so let's, Zainab, do you think we should like look at CSS files or just keep rolling with the style
I think
tag for a minute?
CSS files, since that's the one that we're gonna be
Yeah,
using.
good. That's a good call. Yeah, let me refactor this to put this stuff into a CSS file, and that'll be really good for us to see. So in this same directory, I'm just going to make a file. I'm just going to call it styles.css. I'm going to copy this stuff. I'm going to paste it there and fix the indenting. And I'm going to go ahead and use that nice format document command. And I get the command prompt by Command-Shift-P. And I need to configure the default formatter. Prettier, which is great. Yes, let's use prettier. Makes my life so much easier, makes this so much more readable. Again, from the perspective of CSS, it cares about the opening and closing curly brackets and the semicolon. Like, here's how I would add two rules on the same selector. So this applies to all paragraph tags. I could also do this again and do maybe like font weight for font style. There we go. Italic. So this is also where the cascading comes in. Like the browser will just bundle all of these up and apply them to all paragraph tags, but it does that in order. Does everyone feel good about like kind of the basic layout of a CSS file? And this part here, oh, and then you add comments with the / and the star. So it does get to be a lot. Like we're now looking at essentially like formats for 3-4 different languages between HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and Python. It is a lot. There's no way around that.
The block of the CSS code, are those just what do you call those? Just rules or styles?
Great question. I would call this a block. I think you're exactly right.
The block.
And then each individual one is a rule right here. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Okay.
I'm not 100% on that, but that's in the ballpark. And now very much like we did with the script tag. And here again, VS Code is kind of being amazing because it knows what we want to do. And by the way, I can use the up arrow and the down arrow to move through this. Or for even more fun, Control N and Control P for next and previous. Control N and Control P is like a very, like you'll see that on the command line. It's from the 70s. It's like built into all sorts of stuff. The idea being that it's a little easier on the keyboard than moving your fingers to go to the up arrow and down arrow. I would, yeah, just start with the up arrow and down arrow if you've been using the mouse. That's a good like next step. And now we should have our style.
Hey, Adam, can I jump in for a second?
Sir, absolutely.
So when I first started to try to do a little bit of HTML coding, I would apply the attribute CSS tags in the element like you've done up there on the
Yeah.
bottom left, up
Yeah, the
page
inline
style.
styles. Yeah,
And if you don't do these CSS files, you'll go crazy
yeah.
very quickly trying to keep track of what is formatting what.
Excellent point. Yes. Yes. Inline styles is bad practice. It's an anti-pattern. Like I will say, especially for smaller projects, especially as you're learning CSS, when you're experimenting, if it's easier, don't hesitate to use it. And you can follow the rule of like, make it work, make it right, make it fast, and use inline styles and then refactor it into a file. Using a CSS file is best practice. And even with CSS files, it can still make you a little crazy, to be honest. Like organizing CSS is a challenge. Jim, thank you. That's a great point. And folks too, if I've been missing like hands that are up or anything like that, I apologize. I wasn't looking at the correct Zoom window. So I just want to check in too to see if other people had questions. Cool.
I've got a quick question, if you don't mind, Adam.
Absolutely.
Just out of curiosity, on the paragraph section of the CSS page, you have color red at the top. Now, later on in that section, if you were to change the color, would the latest change of the color override the initial color of red? Great
question. Let's find out. In fact, let's do it in two places. Let's make, and I was wanted actually perfect timing because I wanted to show we have this pretty amazing color palette. You can also define colors with red, green, blue, like numbers that indicate the amount of red or green or blue. Let's do it here too, and we'll color it. Let's see, we have red, we have green, we have blue, so let's end up with a yellow, and we'll see what happens. That's a great question. And by the way, the best thing to do if you're not sure about something is to experiment. Zach, you probably can do the other color palette. There's a bunch of ways to do colors in CSS. Sometimes it does get a little tricky depending on like how the browser renders it. So you would just have to check. And Corbin, that's a great suggestion of colorhunt.co. Yeah, this is awesome. There's so many good resources out there for like CSS and styles and stuff. That's beautiful. Corbin, if you could please throw that one in the Sierra Resources channel, that'd be awesome. And you get like color palettes, which is great. So yeah, like for folks with one of the things I have to say about doing front-end software engineering that's great is if you're at all interested in like design and user interfaces, you really end up learning a ton. But we've got all these rules. So it starts greenish, or it starts red, goes greenish, and then ends up yellow. And my guess is it is going to end up yellow. Let's see what happens. I'm actually surprised that didn't quite work the way I thought.
In the body, do you need a closing caret? I don't know how to say that. For, where is it? Line 22? Or do you leave that open? Or the style color?
Oh,
in the first P.
the first P
Right at the
has
start.
closing parent right there. It's just a little hard to see.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and actually in that, on that note, like when you have a lot of elements, sometimes you'll see people write it like this, which is a little weird, but does make it like a bit more explicit. But the formatter, but I might not be. Got the styles. That's saved. That's saved. Let me make sure, actually, this is a great example of debugging. First, okay. I'm not loading the styles, the CSS styles, because here we see all the network requests from the browser, from the client to the server. We get the HTML page, we get the one JavaScript page, we get the other, but no CSS. And I will say one of the challenges of web development is silent failures. Nothing broke. It just was that we didn't see something rendering as expected. So it's always good to start at the very beginning, like what is happening between the client and the server, and you use the network tab and you go from there. So let me see, I probably just forgot how to format the
Was it working before?
I don't think it had been working because it's not a style tag, it's a link tag. That would do it. So this is just part of the process of learning this stuff. By the way, another nice thing that you can do is if you right click and go to rename symbol or use the F2 keyword. It just will do that everywhere for me. So this is the other way in HTML that we access other pages. Why it's this way and not another way, there is no good answer. This is just some of the quirks of HTML. Href is short for like, I want to say hyperlink reference or the URL. What's in it?
I think so.
Yeah. In this case, the URL really is like the path to where this file lives because we're grabbing a file. And here, this is the relationship of this link asset that we want to the rest of the document. And we need to tell the browser that it's a CSS style sheet. Let's see if that works. And that does work. So again, welcome to the world of web programming, where there's a lot of like history and cruftiness and things are a little different. The good news is it's not the end of the world. Again, with debugging, the rule of thumb is like always go like maybe 3 steps back to the very beginning and then kind of walk through the process. It's slower in the beginning, but what you really want to avoid when you're debugging is a bad assumption. Because I have made so many bad assumptions about what I think is already working. And I spent 3 hours trying to figure out the problem. And then it turns out something that I thought was good was actually bad in my program. And that was where the problem was. So I've become like very systematic. Like when I'm debugging, I go all the way to the beginning. I don't make any assumptions. And it's a little slower, but it avoids that sort of nightmare situation. So now we get to circle back to the excellent question of like, if I have a bunch of style rules, like a color here, a color here, a color here, which one gets applied? And here we can see that it is the yellow. And we can in fact see, here's the cascading behavior again, where it just went through all the rules in order. And if I switched it up, you know, and I put yellow first, then we'd end up with the green because that's the last one. Yeah, that was a great question. What else would people like to see that you're curious about with CSS? There are a couple things that I need to cover, but that was a great thing for us to walk through. So what else is on people's minds? An image Brian, that's a great question. We're not gonna get to images today. Just because there's a little bit more of CSS that we need to cover. Actually, I can very quickly add an image. I take that back.
I looked up the same thing.
Sorry.
I looked up the same thing.
Oh,
I
cat
was gonna-
images. Yeah, that's we're all great minds. Though this URL is a nightmare. I need to find a good.
Cat with the glasses.
I'm sorry.
Cat with the glasses.
Oh, this one over here.
If there's a good URL for it.
Yeah, that'll do it. I don't know what, we don't need to worry about what all this stuff is. It's some super long URL. Curious what copy link address does. Okay, that's much cleaner. So I'm just gonna add an image that I'm getting from somewhere else on the internet. We use the image tag or the image element. We use the source attribute. And I need to make sure I get. So here I'm going to do that thing I said where I do it that way. Because this is so long. And I forget if I need a closing tag or not. Let's see.
Can you find it?
What do you think? Do we need? And actually I should quickly Google this. Image, source, blah, blah, blah.
No, it didn't.
Yeah. I'm not sure why that one didn't.
Try the other link.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. And then if that doesn't work, we'll abandon it. But the,
Do you need to put .jpeg on it? I didn't see it on there
oh,
when
that's a
you
good question.
brought it.
That is a good question.
It looked like it was there for the.
Yeah, let me try. There's a little confusing which one was which. Like, I might have missed it. Let's see if that was it.
I think you gotta put it in the body, inside of the body.
Well, if you go back to the. Yeah, that one should work.
Yeah, okay. The way they had like two URLs to this image asset. One, I think, was more like user friendly and something was happening behind the scenes. The other one actually was pointing directly to the image asset itself. And so if I had an image on my, if I had an image in the same directory as the index.html file, I would just do this. Maybe it's in an images directory, my cat pic.jpg. And so it would, that's how it would look like if the image was a local image asset on the server. And
Do we need to worry about copywriting?
if you are doing something involving money where there's enough money where someone will care, then yes.
Okay.
Or like fun, personal portfolio stuff, no, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And that is something that's it's really good to be mindful of. And note, we've got the other image. It doesn't work, but I'll leave it there as an example. This cat pic doesn't exist, but if it did in images directory, this is how we display it. Yeah, great question. That's fun to see. And this stuff does start to get fun. Yeah, honestly, for the purposes of class and learning, steal whatever you want. That's like the beauty of the internet. Like, definitely just go wild. Let me show a bit more about CSS and how we can like take advantage of selectors and specificity. There is an interesting attribute that you can give to pretty much any HTML element called ID. And it uniquely identifies that element. It's a unique ID. And so now here, if I want to find the element that has whose ID is title, there we go. I do something like this. And let's make font style. Maybe is it text decoration, underline? What were you gonna say?
No,
Color, how about font family? Let's do Franklin New Gothic, something. And the font family, that one wasn't so interesting. Let me see if I can find a better one.
Wingdings.
Wingdings. It doesn't seem to have wingdings. We're just gonna go with something and we'll make the color, purple. So this is the only element in the entire document whose ID has the value title. You probably can use the same ID value on multiple elements, but you shouldn't. And there's a high level of specificity. And to give that as an example, actually, like right here for the H1 element, I set the color. But here, this rule has a higher level of specificity. And I guess, Jim, to kind of go back to your question here, I was trying to point at the screen and you folks can't see it. But in this hovering here where it says selector specificity, I don't know exactly what each of these numbers stand for, but because I know that selecting by ID is basically the most specific way that you can get. And we've got the number 1 first. That indicates a higher level of specificity. And here we've got the 1 back there. There's a lower level. I think it might have like decimal values like 0.5 and stuff too. But that's the basic idea. And I'm curious what people think about that and if that makes sense, because that's like the big concept in CSS is this idea of specificity, because it means that it's really nice with the paragraph tag. Like, you know, with the heading, there's probably only one H1, but with the paragraph tag, we might want each paragraph to be a certain style, but then there's one paragraph I want to be different, and I can give it an ID or a class, as we'll see in a moment, and point to it that way. So I just really want to check in with people, and I'm curious what people think. Feel good? And this is where CSS does start to get a little programmery in that, like, you do have to start thinking through the precedence and order of rules and stuff. And it's where it drives some people nuts because it's not like writing imperative code. We're declaring the rules. This is declarative, and then it is the browser that's figuring it out. And I think the key to unraveling the pain, because it is really frustrating for some people, and it was and still is for me, is seeing the rules of specificity and using developer tools, and also adding it in one piece at a time. And the last thing is not getting complicated, because there are ways where you can write really terrible spaghetti CSS that's very hard to parse. Like, for instance, you can add, how do I do this again? CSS coordinates. Yeah, like here, if I add like important to a rule, actually, it might be better to do it here for the H1. Even though over here in the rule that has the higher specificity, getting an element by ID title, the color is purple. I think with this important flag, it will override that. And let's see what the color of our H1 is. Yeah, and then if we look at it, this is where Jim, as to your point, looking on the right gets really useful. We can see all the rules. Anything crossed out means it's not used. Computed is where you go to see what ended up being applied, and then it takes you to see where it is. Imported is an anti-pattern. It just creates nightmares because it's impossible to understand, because you have to go and find all the importance when you want to change stuff. So you should not be using that. I don't, unless there's a very specific reason to, or you're instructed to. Important should be avoided. So the last big CSS rule, and the most interesting and kind of excited one, is the class. Ooh, excuse me. Let's do a nice blue violet. Let's do a font. Let's do a border of 4px solid green. Let's do a padding 8px. And let me show you folks what we're doing here. What else should I put inside this div? I'll put another div just for the heck of it, and a paragraph, and
You need a list.
a list. That's a great idea. Yeah. So UL stands for unordered list. Yeah, that's a great call. Yeah, we didn't get into. There's all sorts of interesting list things. Going to use format document, which doesn't seem to be.
On 31, you have a div instead of UL.
Oh, thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, because it added it automatically. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Let's try that again. Figured, I thought it, or cannot. Sorry. There we go. So VS Code has its own formatter. For some reason, Prettier Code didn't want to play nice with the HTML file that it should. So now we're going to have a list. I'm also going to add a button, and you would connect this button to JavaScript. So let me show you folks this, and then we can use a CSS class. So if I inspect my document and look at the tree, right? Sorry, I'm getting so excited about trees. This is also like one of the few times where we can point and say, yes, this is where data structure gets used. But of course, the browser has the algorithm doing the depth first or breadth first search, or however it does it to like parse the tree. We don't have to write that. But now if you wanted to write your own parser for HTML, you have most of the pieces of the puzzle. So we have all these things that are children of this div, this node in our tree. And maybe we want to apply some CSS styles to all of them. So we can use a CSS class, and this is probably the most common. You can use multiple classes, by the way. Make everything violet. Like for instance, let's grab this. And actually, I'm going to change these names a bit, because this is a great example of how you actually want to organize CSS. There are like different philosophies. People talk about object-oriented CSS. People talk about, there's something called BEM, B-E-M, and I don't remember what it stands for, block something, something. But there's an idea where you write a class to like apply a certain behavior, and you compose the classes together. Like over here, I'm going to add two classes, add border and padding, and make everything purple. Or violet. And because I have these two classes and they each do one specific thing, kind of like writing two different functions that you use together, or two different classes that you use together, it's easier for me to organize my CSS. And we don't inherit, but we compose. We can use these different classes to compose more complex behavior and still stay sane in the process. So if I haven't gotten anything wrong, which I totally did because I added all of this to the closing div tag instead of the opening one. So let's fix that. And let's format this again. So to recap, up here, there's every HTML element has an attribute named class. And as it says, it's a space separated list. It's not a comma separated list. It's a space separated list. As it says here, classes allow CSS and JavaScript to select and access specific elements via the class selectors. Or there's a JavaScript function that does the same thing. And this right here is a class selector. And we can see this is like our least specific kind of selector. The one is already all the way at the end. This is our most specific selector by ID. And then class is right in the middle in terms of how the rules get applied. So ID will override class. And now the moment of truth, voila. The div has a border and padding. Padding is empty space. And you can kind of see it here in the box. You can, and this is what we'll talk more tomorrow about. I didn't really, I think we're probably reaching a natural stopping point for today. Like I didn't really get to talk about block elements or inline elements or padding. I think what I will do is I'll use this moment to talk about the box model. And then I think I'll share a good link for folks. But the way that stuff gets rendered in the browser and the way that CSS and HTML thinks about stuff is everything is like a box. And I think as you kind of highlight over this, you can kind of see what I mean. Like these are like rectangular boxes, but boxes nonetheless. And a box has the content. And in fact, let me pick this box. This box has content. It has padding. And note that I didn't add that padding. That came by default with that unordered list element. And there are some default like sort of style, CSS style settings. And we kind of need to override those a lot of the time. And there are some tools we use to do that. Every box has a border. This box has no border. But if I wanted to, I could give it a border. 2px short 7. And as you can see, you can go really in depth. You can style the left, the right, and let's do padding 0px and note how that moves that back. Maybe I want it to be 40px. Maybe I want it to be 10px. And again, that's all. If I refresh the page, I'll lose all that. And then every box has a margin, the space between the box and the other boxes. And there are a bunch of rules about how this stuff gets computed. And I think probably, I keep saying tomorrow, but I really mean Monday, I think after the assessment, because tomorrow I think is a review day.
No,
Oh,
tomorrow, yeah, tomorrow
we did
was
more.
a lesson, yeah.
Okay, I take that back. We've got more. We'll squeeze in a little review, maybe after lunch. The moral of the story, I'm kind of repeating myself, but in terms of how this stuff gets laid out and rendered, everything is a box and the browser just kind of flows top to bottom. and throws one box after another. And as you've noted, unless you add a rule otherwise, the width of the box takes up the whole page. And when we start talking about layout with CSS, we'll see how to make a box not take up the whole page and put things next to each other. That's not so critical right now. And yeah, there's totally a span tag, and that's the one that you can use for inline stuff. I will demonstrate that really quickly, I think. And let's put this right here, maybe like me too. Span class. Well, I don't have a good class, but span. I'll use an inline style, which you shouldn't, but for the purpose of the demonstration. And now over here, that's my span tag. So really you would want to write another class and then style the element that way. So this is probably a good point to pause and check in, because I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and also I've just been doing a lot of talking. So I'm curious what's on people's minds, what it might be good to go over again, and how people are doing.
Could you go back to the CSS page? Or
Absolutely.
yeah. Sorry, I think I missed a lot of stuff that happened in this.
No problem. Yeah, and please, I should have said this much earlier, but I hope that people have not been coding along to this. This is definitely like a get an overview kind of lesson. And then all the exercises today about kind of applying this stuff. What in particular did you want to look at here?
I just wanted to see where you added the add border and padding in the HTML page.
Got it. Yeah. So we defined the class here in our CSS file. And then here, where we have this div that contains all the other stuff, we use the class attribute, and we add the names of the classes that we want to apply to this attribute. And I had two of them here. And I just separated them.
That's what I missed. I didn't realize that you could add two classes in the same thing.
Yeah,
Cool.
for sure. Yeah, I think like most tutorials won't show you that. And it's actually incredibly useful because having, again, think about functions, like having a function that does one specific thing is easier to work with and use than like a function that does four things. It's better to have two functions that each do one thing and combine them and compose them. And so these are sort of like functions. Like I have the one for the color that I want for a bunch of stuff, and like the border and padding information, I combine them together. And then if I want to use this class somewhere else for any reason, like over here, I can. And actually, this raises a good point. The way that HTML works, the class name is just a string in these double quotes. There is probably a VS Code plugin that we could get and that we should get that will tell us when we mistype a class and get a typo. I don't have that configured. That will not throw any sort of error. All that will happen is that the style won't be applied. So that's probably the most common kind of programming error to make when you're writing HTML and CSS, is simply to mistype the class. And actually, VS Code help HTML class name string typo. I will circle back to that one, because that's something that really it would be good to have our editor help us with. And there's probably an extension that I don't have installed that will. But yeah, no, that's the cool part about classes. And I think actually what I will do is CSS. So there's, you don't really have to worry about this right now, but there's like a whole, all these philosophies of CSS, like then like blocks, elements, modifiers. It gets quite interesting, actually. It's like a complex problem. And you can also do pretty sophisticated stuff with CSS. Yeah, great question. What else is on people's minds?
Jim has his hand up.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim. Yes, sir.
So it strikes me that if you don't apply any CSS formatting at all, you get a specific color, and it's probably black. And every heading tag is its specific default size. How do you change? I mean, I know how to change for the entire document, but then now let's say that you want to have the H1s have this special coloring. And then what if you want to, do you subordinate CSS tags inside of CSS tags, or are the tag descriptions all at the same hierarchy? If we look at your, can you go back to the CSS? There you go.
Yeah, that's a
So
great.
do you ever subordinate one of those blocks under another?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, would you be defining a block like a rule inside another? You could, you probably can. Like, I can probably do this, I want to say. I'm not sure if this will work, but it doesn't like that, does it?
I think you can put P comma stem.
Yeah, you can do modifiers in front of the curly braces.
That's on
Oh,
line
yeah.
10.
Yeah, so like what you would do is you would do P comma, thank you. So I don't, there might be like, because you can do certain things too with like doing a style for the last item in a list or a group and sort of special cases like that, or like every other thing. And some of those more complex rules might you might add inside a block and have sub blocks. I'm not sure. But as a general rule, no. And Zainab and whoever was saying that, thank you. And so here's the example of how you would write that. I have a rule that every paragraph tag is going to be italic. And now I have a rule that every span inside a paragraph tag, the text color will be black. Jim, you asked a really good question about like browser default styles. And yeah, I'm pretty sure what happens is that basically like browsers inject exactly what's saying here. Like browsers inject a little bit of CSS by default. And honestly, that's usually a little annoying. Like here, if we find the H1, this is actually a pretty great site. I have not seen this before. It looks like it lets us search, and even more annoyingly, the default browser style for how to display an H1 or an unordered list is going to have small differences between browsers, between the different web rendering engines. So what's really common is to use, that's the wrong normalizer. So there's something called a CSS reset, where you clear away all the browser default stuff. And that's what everyone uses when you're doing work professionally. And then someone has put together a style sheet named normalize.css. And we can you can take a look at this, and it describes what it is. And it's going through and setting everything to like a much more like plain, minimal, or non-existent default settings, so that you don't have any of that default stuff when you start applying styles. And then I think the last part of your question was like, kind of, how do I get my rule to apply to everything? There are two ways to do that. One is using the selector by tag or by element. Like this rule will apply to all the H1s in our document. So like in a professional setting, like the first thing that you see on every HTML page is like the CSS normalizer file to wipe the slate. Like that's the first thing that gets loaded. And then you will usually have like a globals CSS style page where you might have like what the default setting should be for all the H1s and stuff. And then you would have other CSS files that would have rules for like more specific cases. Like maybe on this one page, H1 should look different. The other way that like rules get applied globally is what's very common is maybe you might not, you can put a CSS class on the body of the whole document. That can be a little tricky. What's a lot more common is you just wrap everything in a div. Like a big use of divs is to break stuff into groups and apply like CSS classes in mass. Like let's call this global styles. And you know, this might not be the best way to do it. I'm a little rusty on best practice, but it's in the ballpark. And maybe we want the font family, because that's a great example of something that you would want to set globally, is whatever Verdana is. And maybe we want the font size to be 8 pixels, which is ridiculously small, but should produce an interesting visual change. And it's hard to tell. Let's maybe background color aqua. That's a better one. So that's one way to apply a style globally. Yeah, really good question. And I see a couple other folks have questions as well. And Jim, was that helpful?
Great, thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Great question. Ben, yes, sir.
Could you make the button do something?
Yes.
JavaScript.
Yeah, we're going to get more into this later. But the great news is it's really straightforward. One of the cool attributes, and I'm going to fiddle this around a little bit for the way that I kind of like to look at this stuff as I start to add more things. There's an on click attribute, and this runs JavaScript. You wouldn't want to like write the JavaScript inline, but you can. What you would really want to do, actually, I'll do it in 2 steps. So now when I click on this, basically, we'll talk about the document object model and kind of how it's called events. When you click on something, it fires an event. The browser listens for the event and figures out what code it should call. So I can have my code inline. If I also here add a function, handle button click. Then we would do it this way, handle button click. And this is also where it's a little annoying because again, we don't get nice editor language features to make sure I don't have a typo. I probably need to actually call method. Yeah. And so then down here, you see I'm just printing out this click handler function called. Yeah, great question. We're going to dig more into that later. And there is a huge piece of that puzzle called the document object model that is like the browser's model of this whole page and how to deal with user interactions and events and stuff. Yeah, the browser is complicated. Don't underestimate the browser. The browser is like a very complex tool, and front-end software development honestly is complex because it touches so many different parts. But it can be a very interesting field. It's where I've done a lot of work front end and back end, but more front end, as you folks can probably tell, because I'm relatively familiar with this world. Let me go ahead and stop the recording. This is a great lesson. Thank you.